Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with Chenmara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight we're going back to the series of Occult and Crochet. The last few weeks have been a little bit interesting with Christmas and things. So, unfortunately we'll have to skip that tonight, but a large amount of time just because of his position in modern occult circles, and that person is Alexander, one of the fathers of modern witchcraft. We'll get into that. And they're still around today and still growing at a fairly good rate. Many groups have actually hived off of Alexander's original groups, and they have grown from his original to pretty much be almost a worldwide coven. I won't say it fully worldwide, but they're getting there. And so let's hop right in here, starting at the beginning. Alexander was born Oral Alexander Carter in June of 1926. And from here on out, I'm just going to go by Alex. That's what his common name was. We're going to stick with that. It was also the name he used outside of the coven, and there's something with that, so I'll get into it, but foreshadowing. He was the oldest of 6 siblings that survived past childhood. I couldn't find an exact reference if there was children born before him and they passed, but there were 6 of them that made it past the teen years, which is survival to adulthood and back in the day. He was raised in a working class family. His parents, Mother Hannah Jane Bibby, I believe, and Father Oral Harold, which was his common name, Alexander Carter, were unwed, and from what I found, never did get married, but they had multiple children together, houses and things like that. They were together. Harold was a general laborer, and his mother was a domestic servant. And to clarify domestic servant, I actually looked it up, and for the time period, it would be something we would call today either a maid, a cook, and or a nanny. It was someone who basically showed up at 6 o'clock in the morning, took care of the household while the parents were off or just didn't want to take care of things, and then when 6-7 o'clock at night after dinner was done, possibly kids to bed, then this person would leave. So it was an all-around servant, but it was basically tied to one family, not multiples. While Alex was very young, his parents changed their surname to Sanders. And I could not find an exact reason why they switched it over. It just said that they changed it, and that was the sources I found, because I checked multiples to try to figure out, my hair's being annoying, where it came from, but they just picked Sanders. So, and he didn't know about his name being Carter until he was much older in life, and he was filing for government paperwork, and then it was discovered that he actually had a surname of Carter, but he did actually change it to Sanders because he didn't want Carter on there. So, while young, Alex attended a spiritualist church. The spiritualist churches were the ones that arose out of the era of the Fox sisters and that time period, table knocking, wall rapping, levitation, things along those lines. And Alex began being a medium while in the church. During this time, he also took up work at a manufacturing chemist's laboratory. And the closest definition I could figure out for that was he worked at a manufacturing company that produced like bottles and vials and stuff, or chemicals for laboratories and chemists. The wording was weird on it, and so trying to look it up was a little interesting. Alex would marry his first wife in 1948. He was 22, she was 19. His wife at the time was named Doreen Stretton. Lots of children. Because he came from a fairly large family, he wanted the same for himself. But Doreen was not okay with Alex's spiritualist and occult interests and activities. So she was pretty much done having children and said, we're done here. But eventually, because of her dislike of all of his interests, she would take the children and leave and divorce him when Alex was 26. So they were only together 4 years. Side note, and I thought this was entertaining, so I'm sharing it. According to Alex's future wife, Maxine, not so pleasant things at a certain period of time, and we'll get into that. This is one of those things, but it's funny. So, he cursed Doreen with abundant fertility. How is that a curse? She didn't want more kids. She had 2. That was enough for her. But Doreen would get remarried and pop out 3 sets of twins. She had 8 children, 6 of which came in sets of 2. I'm going to say that the curse worked. I'm just throwing that out there. Later, Alex would take a job as at a pharmaceutical company and made friends with his future wife's mother. So he made friends with his future mother-in-law. And his future father-in-law, no name given, hated Alex. Absolutely loathed this man. And it was said that his future father-in-law was convinced that Alex was a homosexual, and in that time, the 30s, 40s, 50s, that was not something that you wanted labeled. I don't care where you were in the world, that was not something that you wanted to be labeled as, just because of the church's very heavy influence. You had that Victorian Puritan value system, and it was just anything outside of like one man, one woman missionary position was deemed evil. And so Alex, being Alex, the way he was, his future father-in-law was like, no way in hell. So, but I have found no direct evidence of Alex being gay, and I'll get into that in a minute. But his father-in-law just didn't like him, and so that was an easy way to try to tag it to make it look bad. Didn't work, by the way. Alex would meet, court, and eventually marry Arlene M. Morris. Maxine is how she would go by, and Alex would marry in June of 1968. This, I think, is more of a concern than his sexual proclivities, was Maxine was 20 years younger than Alex. Picture. So, this is Maxine, and this is Alex. He's not a spring chicken. And she was definitely a spring chicken. I think she was like 19 or 20 when they got married. So, that's a little interesting side note there. In 1968, Alex and Maxine would have their first daughter, Maya. Maxine would claim that during the marriage, Alex was an openly bisexual man and would sleep around with other men. From what I could find, Dorito, something along those lines, but from what I could find about him was he didn't sleep around with other women, so he was loyal within his relationship. My phone's going off, just one second. It was very defined. He was loyal, female wise, to Maxine. He just liked to play with men on the side, so that was a little odd tidbit that I found. Alex and Maxine would eventually divorce, and Alex would marry one final time to a woman named Jillian Sicca in December of 1982. His personal life is interesting, so I'm putting it at the beginning, but that's not the focus, because he is most definitely an interesting person altogether, and we're getting into that now. There's much debate, and I mean a lot of debate, even today, about how Alex came into the occult or witchcraft or Wicca. One story goes, and this is his story, or for his first real story, but we'll get into that. Alex arrived unannounced by himself, oddly enough, at his maternal grandmother's house, so his mom's mother, when he was 7 years old, while she was mid-ritual, because supposedly she was a Gardenian, Gerald Gardner line witchcraft. or around that time period. I don't remember the exact, there's a lot of information there. But she was very mad about him interrupting her and told him, and this is the part where it gets a little bit scandalous, told him to strip down and initiated him that very day into the level 1 of her brand of Wicca. The story goes that she threatened to kill him if he told anyone about the initiation or what he saw that day or what happened to him. Over the next 3 years, she took him from initiate to level 3, which basically made him a high priest at the age of 9. Think about that. And allowed him to memorize parts of her Book of Shadows. She supposedly taught him how to scry with ink, to use a crystal ball, to use crystals for healing and scrying. But there's a major flaw in this story. It's been since revealed in a publication called Wibberley that Alex's maternal grandmother died before Alex was even born. Matter of fact, she died before Alex's mom and dad ever got together. Alex's mother was 4 years old when her mother died. So Grandma Bibby could not have taught him anything because his mother was a baby when her mother died. So, unless Alex was being initiated into in the spirit world, which is possible, I guess, that particular story didn't exactly happen. But it's part of the lore of Alex Sanders, so it's worth discussing just because he was a very interesting person, and I came across him actually in my personal experience secondary. I first came across Gerald Gardner when I first started really getting into alternative beliefs, and he's the one that started my interest in this, and Alex came along into my world almost 10 years later than that, because I'd already been involved in other stuff, and this name started popping up, which is weird considering the crossover that occurs with these two gentlemen, not in physical form, but in their spiritual practices. Another version of a story is from Patricia Crowther. She claims to have received letters from Alex that said he was never fully initiated into any group, and this was in the early 60s. In these letters, he claimed to have a deep interest in the occult, but later on he claims to have received a year-long initiation and training into a form of Gardenian witchcraft, and the witch who initiated him was a woman by the name of Medea. Alex's wife Maxine said this was a true statement, but no one else in their little circle of covens and friends knew if this was for sure an initiation or not. Something that has come to light in the last few years is, as in the last 20 years, a priestess by the name of Pat Kopinski, and there's like 5 different spellings of her name, so if I'm saying it wrong, it's because that's the spelling I went with, is most likely the woman who actually initiated him in or around 1962. It's a little fuzzy on that part, but she is the one who said that she did the initiation. It is said that she allowed him to copy from her personal Book of Shadows. It is also believed that it was Pat that gave Alex his coven name. So within the coven, he was not called Alex. Within the coven, he was called Verbius. And in covens, they usually give you a name to be used within the circle. It is not to be used outside of that, although Alex was a little bit more controversial in some of his practices. So a lot of people did find out his actual name, his coven name. But within the coven, that was a name that was very sacred. It was the person who initiated you into the coven would give you this sacred name. So that was his. A little definition term here. A Book of Shadows is a book of spells and rituals used within a coven. In most cases, this is something held very, very sacred within a coven. Each member had their own copy, and this is a way to keep the secret of the rituals together without publishing them in books, because that was very dangerous to even admit to knowing such things. So it was especially in the lineage types and family line ones, if like let's say your grandmother was a witch and she handed it to your mother, that mother handed it to you, you would automatically be passing that on to your child, because the power of that line, because it came through your bloodline, is amazing. And with covens like the Alexandrian and Gardenian groups, those are lineage covens, therefore their Book of Shadows is going to have rituals very specific to those covens. And a personal Book of Shadows has a lot of personal work as well, letting anyone else access to that. You think journals are sacred? This tops the cake for that. But some little rules about a Book of Shadows. They are never to be typed or use a machine to copy. They must be hand copied, and the term of what they're copied into is a virgin book. And that means a book that was purchased for this purpose and has never been used for anything ever. So instead of buying like a notebook that you've taken put in recipes or two and you tear those out and you start writing your Book of Shadows, technically, big no-no, don't do that. It is said that you would purchase this book for the sacred text, and it would never to be haggled or bartered over. You pay the asking price. That way you're not diminishing the value of what you're using it for. There's just little things that go along with this that increase your personal opinion, or not opinion, your personal power with the book, and that is part of them. What is going on here? Okay, never mind, sorry. And so you really wanted to make sure you were taking care of your book. It is something to be secreted away. No one else was supposed to see it except for the person you initiate. Now, in Priestess Pat's thing, she let him have access to not just the group's Book of Shadows, but her personal one, from what I was finding. And that's a very intimate thing, not so much like amorous, but like getting to know someone on a deep level. Those are things you just didn't share with people, because there's a lot of personal stuff in there. So another little side note here, just going along with the Book of Shadows initiations, Maxine claimed that all of Alex's younger siblings were powerful psychics as well, and it was not uncommon, according to Maxine, to walk into the house when the brothers were calling an apparition into a physical form during a seance. If that's true, that's amazing, but it's only Maxine's version of the story, and I'm not doubting her, but she's the only one that's talked about it. So the other part about it that makes me not so much question, but like need more details, is Alex's mother was supposedly okay with the woo-woo that went on in the house, but it was said that she was very shocked and upset when Alex went public with being into Wicca. So balancing those two, unless she was just worried that he was going to be demonized and beat up and all that stuff, which is a mother's concern. So not sure how that all tied together, but it was things that just kind of caught me as interesting or strange. So in 1962, Alex convinced the Manchester Evening News, and this is what Alex's mother was a little bit shocked about, to do a front page article on Wicca. From what I could find, this was the first ever positive article on Wicca written in the last 200 years. 200 years or so up to that point. This may have had good intentions, just because he was trying to get the word out that this wasn't a bunch of devil worshippers. But it blew up in Alex's face in some pretty big ways. He lost his job at the library he was working at, because when they found out what he did, they were like, oh, no, get out. And then Patricia Crowther, the first person in the Gardenian group that he started writing to and trying to get initiated by, stopped communicating with him. She thought he was a troublesome upstart and a pest, dangerous to the secrecy of the covens. Even though Patricia was not impressed with Alex, Priestess Pat K, and I'm shorting her name to that, was okay with bringing him into the fold, and it is said that she would lead Alex to eventually becoming a high priest for the coven that they were in, and alongside the high priestess Sylvia Tatham. And there's not really a connection outside of Wicca with Alex and Sylvia, but Priestess Pat was actually the elder in that group, so she could initiate and elevate people pretty easily, as far as like at her discretion type of a thing, because in most covens, not all, but most, you have an initiate, which is your kind of level 1. Some places split it up, but generally you have 3 levels, which is initiate 1 year. You have practitioner, which is just general in the group, and there's different names for it, and you can stay there as long as you want. Then you go to level 3, which is the high priest or the priestess. And those are the leaders. They're the ones that do the rituals. They're the ones that are there to initiate the initiates and, you know, kind of keep reign over what goes on within the rituals. Then you have what's called an elder. Once you have been a high priest or high priestess, and the times are different, some say 2 years, some say 5, some don't have times, then you can step back from active roles and you become what they would call an elder. So you're the ones they go to for advice, for guidance. They don't classify that as a step in the group. It's more of you're stepping away. So it's not like steps 1, step 2, step 3, elder. It's just kind of another position that's there but not there. And once you have become an elder and you've passed through the other stages, that's when you can hive off, so you can step off and make your own coven, or you can just play an inactive role within the group, being an advisor or counselor. If, you know, the high priest or high priestess can't be there for some reason, you can step back into that role and do it because you've already done it. So Priestess Pat K, from what I could find, was actually an elder, and so when Alex and Sylvia assumed the position of high priest and high priestess, it wasn't pushing her out, she was already kind of off to the sides. So, little tangential. Like I said, there's a lot of information in this one. But these two very powerful leaders within the group led to a massive growth of Wicca. Over the next few years, Alex attracted more and more media attention. And I'll get into some interesting stories with that, because boy did he have some interesting stories. As the years passed, Alex has claimed to have initiated over 1,600 people into around 100 covens. The numbers, some people have very specific numbers, other sites were like around these numbers because it's hard to pinpoint, especially when you're talking secrecy. And even in the time when he was doing this in the 1960s and 70s, Wicca and the occult practices were becoming more common and more okay to be out in the open, but you could still get fired, you could still lose family, you could still have a lot of bad things happen to you. So the numbers are not accurate, super accurate, because it's a little hard to pinpoint those numbers with people wanting to keep anonymous. So and this growth within the covens led to him being granted the title by the covens as the King of Witches. The most growth ever in the lines at that time was under the leadership of Alexanders. And let me be clear, it was the King of the Alexandrian Witches. Still a cool title, but this was after he had achieved high priest and started to move out into that elder stage. He hived off, and that's where you start developing this massive growth of Wicca and witchcraft. It is said, because Alex had some interesting things about him, it is said that Alex could create and summon familiar spirits for the new initiates. That's a cool talent. It's also said that he could heal many ailments, including warts and cancer. The wart one, I just have to let you know, was funny because to heal a wart, it was to wish it to someone who was ugly. They were already ugly, what's another wart, was his opinion. So it was one of those like, did you really just say that? But for him, that was kind of a comedic way of like trying to get rid of the warts. It is also said that he could heal physical deformities, including one on his own daughter. It's something worth looking into deeper if you're interested in more healing research. The information was a little vague because third party or other people watching, not the person being healed and not Alex himself, other people watching would say someone would have pancreatic cancer or something, and he would sit at their feet and hold their feet for 3 days, and the cancer would just go away. There's more going on there. Anyone who works energy knows there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, but that's what they said it was like to watch, is he would just sit there and hold their feet. Doesn't sound like much, but it'd be interesting to know what kind of techniques he was using personally. So, if you're interested, there's always that to look into. Now, there's a fly in the soup here. After Doreen left him, and this was something I alluded to before, and took his firstborn children, Alex took a detour down what is called the left-hand path. The right-hand path is known as a white witch, the white light workers, the positive people. Most of Christianity would fall into that side, but the left-hand path is the other version. It's not so much outright Satan worship, although that is an aspect of the left-hand path, but it's doing things for selfish gain and for self-centered purposes with no thought or care to who you hurt in the process. There's no harm in using magic or mysticism to improve yourself, improve your status, but there's also the dark side of that, is you're doing that with harming others. In most Wicca, and harm ye none is a tag to everything that they do. Yes, we're doing things to increase our wealth as long as we're not harming anybody else. We're doing things to improve our health as long as we're not harming anyone else. That is a huge aspect of this culture, and at one point in his life, he made a huge detour. Just one second. Little on the parched side. This period of time was just after the Second World War, and he admitted that he used black magic to gain wealth and sexual success. As these things will do, he did have some success. I'm not denying that this stuff can work, it's just who are you hurting in the process? And that's karma you don't want. He claims to have fallen in with an older couple who was said to that they thought he had the exact image of their deceased son. This is kind of a sad story just because of what happens. They would go on to bring him into their home, feed him, pay for his clothing, anything he needed as long as he lived there, and eventually he would convince them to buy him a house and give him a stipend or allowance to live on. And this was going on for many years. During this time, Alex lived very lavishly, and this is where he discovered that he liked both men and women in the bedroom. Not one exclusive to the other, he liked them both, so very bisexual. But there was retaliation that he viewed occurred from this, which, understanding how energy works, I'm going to say this was probably the whiplash of what he did. The retaliation for using black magic came when his younger sister was shot by an accidental shooter, and shortly thereafter was diagnosed with a terminal form of cancer. This cancer would eventually take her life, and Alex claimed that all of the bad that befell her, and there was rumors that one of his more frequent bedroom visitors also self-deleted during this time, and it was very troubling to him. It really upset him, and he believed that it was all his fault for using magic for selfish and uncaring reasons. So he decided at that time, after everything fell apart in his mind, he decided to stop using black magic and use his knowledge to teach others and improve others' lives. That's a very an admirable thing to do. It just kind of stinks that he had to go through that, but how else do you know what the light is if you haven't experienced the darkness? And that's kind of why light workers generally have really rough histories. So Alex believed the angels were guiding him, and so he started to study older grimoires. A grimoire is a book of spells and rituals specific to summoning demons into physical appearances. Not something that you should just go willy-nilly into. This takes years of study and practice just to understand the basics, because there's so much there. But these are things that he started to look into. And this is where he started to develop a little bit different of a practice, because he understood this, and then he moved into Gardenian witchcraft, at which point he hived off and created his own lineage of Alexandrian witchcraft. We'll get more into that here shortly. He took a job at a library, guided by the angels, and found the Key of Solomon. Very interesting 14th century manuscript, claiming to be from King Solomon from the Bible. There's some questions about that, but an interesting manuscript nonetheless. And of course, he was fired. But this time, I'm not going to say he didn't deserve his firing. He was removing books from the library and also dismantling books by S.L. Mathers, who I've already talked about before. Mathers was one of the first people to actually translate the Key of Solomon from the original, I believe it was French, into the English language, French-Latin, because there were some really interesting combinations there. But he was the first one to do that, so his translation was the most common. Alex would take them home without asking and copy texts out of them, and then he would also take apart the books and just take out sections of it. So he was caught and eventually fired. Like I said, justified in this situation. But it was from these grimoires that he found parts and pieces to add to his version of Wicca coming later. And this is where the Alexandrian line would be born. Alex's media stardom would be boosted a lot by a book called King of the Witches, published in 1969. The author her name was June Johns, and she wrote this book to kind of go over what it was that Alex was doing, because he was such a fascinating person. And a year later, 1970, there was a movie that would be called The Legend of the Witches. I happen to have a copy here. You can tell it's been well used because I got it at a secondhand place. These two are credited with bringing Alex Sanders to talk shows, public speaking tours, and really launched Wicca and Alex into the media spotlight, into the public domain. This is what brought this information to the public consciousness, more so than anything that had been done before. Crowley had his day, other ones had had theirs days, but they were within their own groups. What Alex had done with the publication of this biography by June Johns and the creation of this movie is he took something that had been kept in the shadows and brought it into the light of day. Never had been done before, and not everyone was happy about what Alex was doing with the media. There were some in the community felt that he was grifting off of the sacred arts to make money. Problem is, he didn't make a lot of money off of anything he did. Not at this time. They also thought that he was dragging the good name of witch through the mud. Seriously? Do you not know your own history? The term witch was already in the mud. He was trying to bring it out of the mud and clean it off. But honestly, this was the best thing that could have happened overall. It showed that Wicca was not a devil worshipping cult. And it took time, but most people came to understand why he was doing what he was doing. But it's not a devil worshipping cult, but it is a nature-based religion. But in Alexandrian, you add the practice of working with other spiritual forces and energies. So you have a lot of additions coming from the original Gardenian, where you just worked with the elements and the Lord and Lady. Maxine was ever the defender of Alex, his second wife. She claimed that Alex never sought out the media. Don't quite buy that, because he did go to the papers in 1962 to get the article published, so he may have started and then realized, oops, later on, but they just gravitated towards him. The media just loved him, so they would just follow him around. Okay. She claims he would attract the attention of the media because he wanted to draw their attention away from other members of the coven so that they could stay anonymous. One couple, and they never put a name with these two, but it was just said a couple, married couple, that was in one of the covens that Alex was in, was fairly high up in a Christian church, and it never said which church or anything else. It was just they were known within the church as important people, but they were also in Alex's coven. They would be completely scandalized if their extra curricular practices and interests were ever found out. They were members of Alex's coven, and people were beginning to get nosy as to about these people. So Alex, being a little bit of a almost savior complex, you could call it, decided to go to the media and make some very bold claims about raising the dead. He was a showman as well as an occultist, and I give him 100% credit for this because it's amazing what he does here. Alex made a great show of raising the dead. He had somebody lay on, from what I could find, it was an actual living person that was wrapped up in burial clothes, draped with a cloth on a stone altar, so to speak. There was a friend of his who was a doctor who confirmed this was a corpse. And so Alex would continue the show with all these media reporters there. And it was a simpler time. One of the comments was it was a naive and innocent time. And he started this whole elaborate ritual, even using barbarous words of incantation, which are the words of magic that are unknowable to the human mind, but they command power in the spirit world. But that's not quite what he did. And it made me laugh when I read, because all this other build-up, I was like, ooh, wow, what did he do? So he laughed about it later and actually talked about what he had done. There was a recipe for a Swiss roll, chocolate, cream filling, all this other stuff. But he read everything backwards. And with very great intent and intonation. Instead of reading Swiss, it would, or let's say roll, it wouldn't be roll, it would be lore, but he would say it in such a way that made people sound, ooh, it's all creepy. So he did this with the recipe, so it was like a 20-minute incantation and it was all for show, but it had the desired effect, because supposedly he raised this dead body, blah, 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 and the media went wild, totally forgetting about the couple that they were poking around about before. You know, the Christian couple that was high up in the church that would go to Alex's ceremonies and not wear clothes and dance around naked in the woods. Suddenly that didn't matter anymore. This dude here was crazy and he looked cool, so this is where we're going. Which was kind of a good thing, but like I said, there were some other things like, what were you doing? But it was funny. And the reason I said running around naked in the forest, nudity was a very important part of these older practices, starting with Gerald Gardner, and going back a little bit before that, even if you dig into some of the history. The practice was called going sky-clad, meaning you're wearing the air as your garment. Alex, in most rituals, would be wearing a loincloth or some kind of light robe, as it was important to have the high priest and high priestess set apart from the crowd. So the majority of the people there were sans clothing, whereas the high priest and high priestess were allowed to wear something. And it was also allowed, if you had passed through the ranks and became an elder, that you were allowed to wear a loincloth or robes as well. But when you are in the circle, which is the sacred space of the Wicca, it is, the reason they would go sky-clad is you have nothing to hide before the Lord and Lady. Everyone is equal. No one is any better than anywhere else. It was a way to keep everyone humble and modest. Not sure if I'm okay with that 100%, but that was the thought process behind it. There was a sacred reason for it. A person of note in the magical community that Alex introduced to and Maxine initiated into the covens was Stuart Farrar. That name might be familiar because they've written several books. Stuart would meet his future wife Janet Owens because of Alex and Maxine. Stuart and Janet Farrar would go on to start their own coven. They'd hive off of Alex's, and they designed their own entire line, and we'll talk about them at a later date. They also wrote many, many books on the craft, and I didn't realize that they were all connected like they were, but they actually did get their start in the occult from Alexander's. So, but it's really not. It's just, again, Alex was a showman, and that was kind of one of the things he did. Alex and Maxine would separate shortly after this movie was filmed. In 1971, they would officially separate, divorce, however you want to look at that. She would remain in London, keeping the coven that she was in alive and functioning and initiating and growing. He would move to Sussex. Maxine was pregnant during the time of the separation. It was a very amicable separation. It was more, I'm going north or to Sussex. She was like, I'm staying here. There was no hostility between the two, but she was pregnant during the separation. They wanted to go different ways and study different things. They were fiercely loyal and devoted to each other. They would deflect curses that were sent at the coven together. They would sometimes send their own retaliation. They're between the two of them. It was just they needed the time to. I think it was Victor, because it was their youngest son, which would be Victor. Wanted nothing to do with his dad's occult practices. None of it, even though the title of King of the Witches was handed down to him. He was pretty much like, deuces, I'm not interested. Kind of weird, but considering his parents broke up when he was still an infant, I mean, there could be some anger there. So, something to think about. In 1979, Alex wanted to make amends for his past deeds, his black magic work. So his desire was, and he made this a very public statement, it went out to the media as well as just within the covens, his desire that one, as a community of like-minded individuals. He hoped, and his prayer and rituals he had done to support this, would be that all would be united into the mainstream. They saw what he was doing, and they were like, that's cool, but this unity that he was hoping that would be built would not make people who practice the metaphysical arts look like crazy people and charlatans and all this other stuff, because it was so close and dear to his heart and that was something that he really felt deeply for. From that public declaration, though, in 1979, Alex would begin to work with where you're awake and you're talking. You'd go into a deep trance. Further developed an order, and I didn't bring this up earlier just because it was a blip, and this is where the meat comes in. Alex developed an order in 1967, long before he met Derek, called the Ordine della Luna. This was similar to an occult lodge, so it was not just the Wicca. This was taking it deeper, more aligned with ceremonial magic and that kind of thing. So think Golden Dawn, Ordo Templis Orientis, and things like that. That's what he was developing. So he didn't just start Alexandrian Wicca, he also developed a lodge. Alex was chartered as the Grand Prior for the England and Wales area. There's some interesting myth and lore that Alex claimed when he developed this Ordine della Luna, saying that he was handed down this information from someone who'd gotten it from 7 generations back, going back to Egypt. So, with celestial intelligences, Alex and Eric, spirits, and the designer of all things, the demiurge, which is a lot of spiritualist movements will reference the demiurge. It's not the source of all creation, it's the former of all creation. Where in Hindu myths, Shiva is the source of all energy, Shakti is the one that forms the world. You've got those two different dynamics going on in this situation too. They wrote many journals and predicted a great deal of things in their time together, including, and I thought this was pretty interesting, an apocalyptic World War III. I tried to find some information about it. I could not in the time that I had. If anyone knows about this particular prediction and where you can find it, let me know, because that sounds fascinating. Anyway, within the order, there's an outer order and an inner order. In the Deucalion, this group was focused on Atlantis and Atlantean magical works. Was the last leader within this inner order of the Order Ordine della Luna. And I'm not going to say the other name again because I'm just going to murder it. So he actually developed a very intensive lodge structure by having an inner order and an outer order. I didn't find a lot out there. Again, time's not really my friend right now, so I'm trying to get caught up after the holidays. But it's something that I do want to look into further later, just because it sounds kind of fascinating, especially having Merlin as your focus for the inner order. But as time goes on and life progresses, Alex Sanders passed into the loving arms of the Lord and Lady on the eve of Beltane, so April 30th, in 1988. He passed from what doctors would say was lung cancer. It could have been other things, but his body was done. Like, you had a good run, buddy. I do have a few links that are in the description for things that are currently in print. The book by June Johns called The King of the Witches is no longer in print. So if you run across one in a used bookstore, I highly advise grabbing it if you're interested in this kind of stuff, because I could not find any source online to an updated version of it. The movie Legend of the Witches is also out of circulation. As you can see, mine came from, I believe it was a library at some point, because we have the little barcode thingy over here. And it might be available on some streaming services. I was running around trying to find some source just so you guys could have access to it, and I couldn't. The one thing that I will say about Legend of the Witches is you get to see an initiation ritual. It's in the 70s, so mind you, the graphics are horrible, the filmography is atrocious, but there's a lot of clotheslessness in it. There's some nudity in there, so you just be aware that that's what it is. But it's done so much in shadow that you can't quite describe and act it out like a little ritual that he does in there. There's a lot of intensity in it, but when you watch it from, so fascinating and so beautiful in a way that you wouldn't think. The one part of it where you're wandering through the forest and you're just being called by a name, the person is no clothes, because that's what they were doing. That's your initiation process. They're like trying not to trip and stumble as they wander through this forest path. There's someone just outside of their view that keeps calling them forward. And then they finally reach the circle, and that's where they're embraced as a brother, because they've traveled through the darkness to reach the light. And when there's a, what do I want to call it, a commentator that talks about it as you're going along, so it's kind of describing why you have to go through this, what the purpose is. You hear Alex talking during the ritual, and the reasons for why he does what he does. Like I said, he blended ceremonial occultism with elemental Wicca and created his own thing. It's pretty fascinating, really, but the movie actually gives you a really good idea of what it is. And like I said, I couldn't find a direct link for anything there, but if you can find it, I highly recommend that movie. And the book by June Johns, everything that I could find about people who've read it and own it, absolutely love this thing. It is basically a piece of history in their minds, especially if you're into the occult. The other links that I put down here were by another biographer of Alex, and it starts with where to go? All the King's Children, and then there's A Place at the Table, A Coin for the Ferryman, which talks about the end of his life and his death. Then the one that I thought was interesting by the same author was A Voice in the Forest. I have not read these yet. Like I said, Alex came into my world late into my history digging. But The Voice in the Forest was after Alex died, there was one coven in 99 to 2003, I believe it was, who claimed to have gotten channeled information from the spirit of Alexander's. And that's kind of the information that's brought forward in the Voice in the Forest. They're interesting. I also put a link if you want to learn more about the covens, where one might be if you're interested in, like, because they'll show you most covens are open to an extent. They'll show you the basics of stuff. They're not going to go into the rituals. You're not going to see their Book of Shadows, but they will be open to discussing things with you. So if you're interested in that, there is a link, alexandrianwitchcraft.org, where you can go check out the website, see what they've got. I wandered through their website. It's kind of interesting. Like, if there was one close, I'd be interested just to sit down and chat with one of these guys or gals, just because, like I said, he's, for what he is, he's one of the more fascinating ones, just because he took ceremonial and Gardenian witchcraft and brought them together and made it work, and then also developed his own private lodge on top of that, which is huge. So with that being said, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video if you enjoyed this particular video, comment below, let me know your thoughts, if you've practiced, if you know more about Alex. This is kind of I'm skimming over the top of someone who's got so much depth. I could probably do an entire series on just Alex, because there's that much out there about him, because he hit the media at such a key point. This, like I said, this is the highlight reel. So if you're interested, drop links, or not drop, yeah, you can drop links, I guess, but drop comments, let me know your thoughts, and I will talk to you guys in a future video. I will be back to doing semi-normal, it's my semi-normal schedule now that the holidays are over. So keep looking on Mondays for the live streams, and Tuesdays and random other days for video uploads. With that, I will let you guys go. Have a great rest of your evening, and I will see you in the next video.